Hey, hello, Cyndy here today. I have something that I want to share with you. This awareness that I've had, or have come into actually over the last number of years. But let's launch off from this verse. There's a verse in Scripture that is John 3:30, and it says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." Meaning, God needs to be bigger than we are. And in order for God to be bigger, the way I always learned it anyways, is that, well, then we better not be too big, and we better not do too much, or we better not show up too strong, because actually God's got to be the one showing up stronger, and God's got to be the one showing up bigger, and God's got to be the one who's taking up the most space. And so the way I initially took that verse, and I don't know if this was specifically taught to me or sort of implicitly in the way it was communicated, but that, okay, well, I better play small, right? Like I better, meek and mild and unassuming, and because of course God's got to be bigger, right? But what I found is something a little bit different. Let me show you. I didn't pre-draw this because I want to draw it together. So, in our common life. Okay, so here's me. So in our common life, we are pretty much a lot of the time at the center of things. We're concerned about our own safety. We're concerned about our comfort. We're watching our bottom line. We're intent on being safe and being careful and cautious, and often there's a lot of fear around who we are or what we're doing or what we might do in the world. And so when in this common way, our self-concern is taking up a lot of the picture here, right? We're really in the center of the picture. We're reckoning every decision based on something about ourselves. And so we take up a lot of space. And so, if this was the frame, right? Like this page is the frame. We're pretty big in that frame. But if we were to begin to risk or trust deeper or hear the Lord's voice and obey the Lord's voice in terms of moving forward in things or risking forward, or then, if the Lord begins to blow through our hearts, it's a pretty bad picture, but if the Lord begins to blow through us like 100-mile-an-hour wind, then, what we could have produced in and of ourselves is like this, right? It's some impact, it's a bit of something, it's a bit of stuff. But when God begins to blow through us, as we risk and as we trust and as we put down our false humility, quite frankly, as we put down our smallness, as we stop playing less than, then God does this thing that actually blows out beyond the sort of boundaries of our world as we would know it. Our experience becomes a vastly different thing, and we realize that God has us, that there's bigger things at hand, that the Lord is intent on pouring in and over and through our lives for the purpose and the benefit for others and different people in different places and at different times. And so as we become more comfortable with that, then we allow, so to speak, or invite or welcome God to blow through us in bigger and bigger ways. And then as God does that, we actually have to zoom out to see the whole picture. So in this picture, right, we're kind of zoomed in. Again, concerned about self, calculating on who we are. But as God begins to blow through us, okay, so maybe I should have done this better. So here in this picture, sorry, this is a little awkward. Anyways, in this picture, as God is blowing through us, do you see the frame here? We are not as big, right? We're not as big. And there's a whole lot more room for the Lord. And then now as we grow in this and as we become more comfortable in this, it continues to carry on. And let me do it this way. And then we will come to find that God is filling up all this space, and this is us right here. And this verse in John 3:30, but he must increase and we must decrease, is about amplification, and it's about perspective. It's not about playing it small, it's about coming forth, allowing God to blow through us, to be in us and to be for us, and to be through us for others in a way that God is amplified. Like as though our life is a megaphone, and it's declaring the Lord in the way that we live. And when this happens, and as this increases, we will become smaller. And God will become bigger. Just by perspective, just by what we know of God and how we begin to experience Him. There's this passage, a story about Elijah in, where is it at? It is in 1 Kings 18 and 19. And Elijah's having this showdown with all the priests of Baal. And so the priests of Baal, they make their altar and they put the wood on and they put the cow cut up on it. And then Elijah does the same thing, has his altar and prepares the wood and puts the cow. Now the priests of Baal, they do everything they can to the test was whoever's God comes down and brings fire to the altar is the true God. Because as Elijah said, how long are you going to keep waffling between one and the other? Either Baal is God or God is God. And so let's have a little test here. Let's try this. So they prepare their altars, they prepare the wood, they prepare the sacrifice. But they're not going to set the fire themselves. They're going to call on their God to do this. And so the priests of Baal, they do all sorts of crazy things. They're calling out, they're beseeching, they're throwing themselves basically into frenzies. They're cutting themselves so that blood would flow because, this would do something, I guess. And so they do this. It sounds like almost all day long and nothing happens. So they've thrown themselves into a frenzy. They've called on their God. And nothing happens. And then Elijah, it's his turn. So his altar is prepared, the wood is put on, the sacrifices, the cow is cut and put on the thing as the sacrifice. And then he had people pour water over the sacrifice and the wood and the altar, 3 different times. So it's sopping wet, drenched in water, right? And then he prays this simple prayer, like, God, you are the one, and would you show us? And this mighty fire of God pushes down and consumes not only the sacrifice and the wood, but the altar and all the water. And then it consumes this altar made to Baal as well. And so the priests of Baal are routed, and Elijah has had this thing of the Lord before him and through him. He held a space for how great God was and is. But then after this encounter, and there's even more to the story after this, but this big encounter, God doing amazing things, like just showing up, blowing them out of the water, so to speak. And then we find Elijah. He goes to a stream. Oh, sorry, my thing here. He goes to a stream, and here's what he says. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who've already died. Oh my gosh, this always cracks me up because I can understand where he's coming from. There was one, the work I do, I'm overseas alongside a lot of pastors and congregations and at conferences, and always praying for people and really just inviting the Lord amongst us as we gather, right? And so that shows up, the Lord shows up differently in every place and time, but it's always this really lovely thing. One day, way back, well, let me say this, as you come into a work of the Lord, there is this place where we are built up in God and where we're standing more solid in the Lord, and where our sense of belonging and our welcome and our gladness has all increased because of the Lord in and over and through us, right? And it's a good place, and it's a nice place, and it's a blessed place. This is the place where God assures us of who we are, and that yes, we are called by his name, and yes, we have important work in the kingdom of God, and that that we're not just making this up in our heads, that this is something of God in us and through us and for us. And so there is this, we have to take ourselves in hand and enter into what the Lord is talking to us about and drawing us forth into. And that's a process of coming into security and coming into love and coming into meaningfulness and purpose. And these are really great things, of course, like things that we all need at the deepest core of who we are. And so God meets us at our deepest need and calls us forth into a dream of his that then meets the deepest needs of others. And so it's this really, really amazing thing. One time, so this was my journey coming into the work that I do. I work alongside pastors and congregations, and I've been in a lot of places. But way back, my very second trip, one of the churches we were at there was a really pronounced darkness over that church and area. Actually, it was quite heavy, felt very heavy, felt very it didn't feel good, like it didn't feel clean and whole and healthy. It felt fractured and chaotic and destructive, actually. And so what the Lord led me to do that day with that gathering of people was to just declare or just share my observation of this out loud with them. And that, if we wanted the Lord's mighty favor and blessing and healing upon us, then we needed to bring what was hidden out into the light, right? And so basically, that's what happened that day. There was this turning to the Lord with what had previously been hidden, and this glorious freedom that permeated everyone's being. And it's just this thing of God. Like he poured in and he poured through and he consumed up the trouble. And it was this, I hardly really actually have words other than to say it was a profound encounter with the Lord that day as we sort of did business with God, so to speak. And then, in fact, it had been such a day that I remember I couldn't get away from the crowd, and my motorbike driver finally just came right to as close as he could basically get to right where I was, and I just had to hop on the bike, and he had to get me out of there because nobody was going to let me go. And so it was this crazy sort of thing. And I get back to the home where I'm staying, and the amplification of the Lord had been so great. And I was then so small and so weak and so human and so just Cyndy, right? And I began to understand that verse in John 3:30 in a different way. He must increase and we must decrease. And so what I found is that we do this by amplification, by living a life that allows the amplification of the Lord to such an extent that we even though we're growing in strengths and wisdoms and clarity and purpose, that as we are overshadowed by God, we realize how small we are. We get it, how small we are. And so when I read this verse and hear teaching around it, what I would like to convey is live in such a way that God is amplified, and don't be afraid of feeling really, really, really small in that, and really, really overwhelmed by the goodness of God, and taken hold of by the Spirit of God, captured by the love of God, because this is where intimacy with God is, where this deep and profound goodness and love of God that completely answers our every need. And so this is what I would encourage today. Live filled up with the Lord, but become an amplification of Him. And then be okay with being small and human and weak. Because we can't produce the same impact that God produces, and we can't create the same, like, it's sort of ridiculous to even consider, right? That, you know, my personal influence is growing all the time, but the influence of God through me, like, there's just no comparison. And so even as we grow up into ourselves, we really want to grow up in such a way that God completely overshadows us and does a work way beyond who we are. So I leave you with that today. Thanks.